Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into the origins and evolution of American government. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also the host of this discussion. And here he is, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Agnes, and welcome to a Wednesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is Wednesday. It is the 11th day of January in the year 2017. It is, as I'm sure those of you listening live, who are with us live now will know, and I'm urging people who pick this program up later on podcast, from the archive. Let me assure you that this is one of the most unbelievable news days that I can remember ever experiencing. I mean, short of, and I can't remember this because, but the fact of the matter is, short of a declaration of war or something, I can't imagine a news day that has more of a variety of news, all of them interacting and canceling each other out and all of this. It is absolutely unbelievable. It's one of the most incredible experiences today that I've ever had, and that's kind of what I'd like to at least open the program with today. I mean, I do want to get back to a few of the things we were talking about yesterday, but this is one of those situations where the whole purpose of the Virtual Center is to basically look at the system that the founders created for us. And we may be witnessing the system undergoing the most significant degree of change that it's ever gone through in its existence. It's absolutely incredible, the kinds of things that are happening. And through all of this, and this, of course, relates in large part to President-elect Trump's news conference this morning. It's the first one he held since July. And I want to open up and begin to talk about that at the beginning. But the issues on the table, as part of that news conference, are incredible. And all the while, the confirmation hearings are going on. The confirmation hearings for Rex Tillerson are going on. I watched the opening of that at 9 a.m. this morning. I listened to the introductory remarks of the committee chair and vice chair and the four people who were given an opportunity to introduce Rex Tillerson to the committee. And then, of course, when the news conference was scheduled to begin at 11 a.m., of course, the major networks shifted from the confirmation hearings to the news conference. News conference was unbelievable. It lasted for an hour and 20 minutes, and it ended 35 minutes before we went on the air. So to try to get a handle on all of this is absolutely incredible. I'd really like to hear from folks on some of this stuff, and I'll get into it, and please feel free to join us. We do have a phone number. We'd love to hear from you. This stuff is conducive, obviously, to the more conversation that we can have about this, the better. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you'd like to communicate with me via email on some of this stuff, I would be honored to hear from you, and I'd like to do the very best I can if what you say is something that I believe our other listeners would appreciate hearing and ought to hear. Then I would like to, with your permission, I would like the opportunity to share it with them. I wouldn't obviously identify you necessarily, and I surely wouldn't do it if you didn't want me to do it. But I know some people are reluctant to go on the air, and I can understand that. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN 906, all one word, lowercase, @gmail.com. And I do encourage you to stay close to our Facebook page. I really do try to post what I think are the most relevant things going on, articles, links to articles about some of the things that I've been reading. Obviously, I don't have a staff. These are things that I myself am reading, and obviously, it may not seem that way, but I do other things besides spend my time trolling the internet. But I do spend a lot of time on it. I do spend quite a bit of time reading because I really believe that I want to stay up on what's going on because of my responsibilities here at the Virtual Center. If you go to Facebook page, the homepage, facebook.com, you will see a search box at the top of the page. And if you type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will be into our Facebook page. And on it, I have posted a number of things. One of them is related to the impending, I guess is the appropriate word, the impending repeal of the Affordable Care Act. This is getting a lot of attention, but there's so many other things that are getting attention as well. Given the size and the significance of the Affordable Care Act in terms of the numbers of people that would be affected by its termination, one would think that no other issue could possibly knock the issues related to the repeal of the Affordable Care Act off the front pages of our major newspapers and off the headlines on our major media outlets. But indeed, that's not true. There is so much going on. The confirmation hearings of Rex Tillerson to be Secretary of State, and the fact that this man is president and CEO of ExxonMobil, one of the largest, most successful corporations in the history of the world. That's going on. The first press conference in 6 months being held by the now President-elect Donald Trump. And the extent to which he used the press conference as an opportunity to attack the media, attack the legitimacy of the media. That was the way the press conference opened. And the behavior of some of the organizations that claim to be news outlets. All of this, it seems to me, is so significant. Where to begin? I think I'd like to begin with the news conference. It ended less than an hour ago. So obviously, as we get time to digest some of the things that happened there and some of the things that were said and the questions asked and Mr. Trump's response to those questions, I think with time we'll probably be able to digest the substance of this news conference in much greater detail than we can right now, because it's basically, it ended within the past hour. But let me give you kind of a brief rundown as to what we were looking at. The first thing that, and again, if you go to the New York Times homepage on the internet, the Times is quickly trying to get on its site as much information on the news conference as possible. So it's posting information as it's happening, and basically this is what I got in response to this. The first major issue that I think is so significant relates to the question of Russian hacking of the Democratic National Committee records and Hillary Clinton's emails and Podesta's emails and all the rest of it. If you remember, ever since the election, Donald Trump has been denying the evidence, refusing to accept the evidence that our intelligence agencies have all agreed on, that it indeed appears to be Russian-inspired hacking. This morning at the news conference, President-elect Trump conceded for the first time that Russia was behind the hacking of democratic institutions during the election. I think it was Russia, he said. Although a few minutes later, he said it could have been somebody else. In the portion of the news conference that I watched, Trump made the point, and you know, I took so many notes that it's a little bit difficult to know where to begin. But one of the things that I jotted down in my notes was the fact that Mr. Trump made the point that the United States is probably the weakest of any entity in combating hacking. He made the statement that of 17 major industries, and he included the United States as an industry in this, he claimed that the United States was 17th out of 17th in its ability to combat hacking. He also pointed out that the Republican committee during the campaign knew that there was an effort to hack its records as well as the Democrats, and that he had moved in and urged anti-hacking provisions and steps be taken in order to protect the privacy of these sources, and it worked. Consequently, he said, the Democrats did no such thing. They were hacked, therefore, and we weren't. The first thing that I jotted down is, my heavens, he's even taking credit for that. Then he pointed out that, as you know, as part of the hacking, that the next, obviously, the fact that he admitted that it was most likely Russia, which is the first time he ever conceded that, then obviously the follow-up, the logical follow-up question is, what about your relationship with Vladimir Putin, if indeed now you acknowledge that Russia was involved in this hacking? Donald Trump made the comment that, kind of an effort to reassure that Russia did it, he said, when asked what he would say to Mr. Putin, Mr. Trump responded, he shouldn't have done it. I don't believe he'll be doing it anymore. So basically, his argument is that even if Russia did it, he's going to be able to stop Putin from continuing to do it. That was the first thing. The second thing, which I think got a lot of attention, was the issue of the reports that there was evidence that Russia has had information on Donald Trump for a long time. And that while there was no specifics necessarily, it was put out on BuzzFeed. I'd like to share with you, because the document that BuzzFeed published is available online. And I'd like to share with you, if I can, some of the major, and again, it's a 35-page document, and I just got it a while ago, but let me basically just share with you a few things. At the very first page, under summary, the information is that the Russian regime has been cultivating, supporting, and assisting Trump for at least 5 years, endorsed by Vladimir Putin. This has been done to encourage splits and divisions within the Western alliance. That's the first point of this report. Secondly, that Trump has declined repeatedly sweeter and sweeter real estate and business deals presented to him by the Russians in order to keep the deals coming, in order to further the Kremlin's cultivation of Donald Trump. His inner circle, according to this report, has continued to accept a regular flow of intelligence from the Kremlin, including intelligence on Democrats and on his political rivals. The third thing is that that the Russians report that they have information on Mr. Trump, on his personal and private behavior, that gives them the leverage that they would need to blackmail him. According to knowledgeable sources, this report says, his conduct in Moscow has included perverted sexual acts which have been arranged and monitored by Soviet intelligence. And finally, a dossier on Hillary Clinton has been collated by Russian intelligence services over many years, and much of this has been made available to the Trump campaign, and it gets even worse. The fact of the matter is, and this came out in the press conference, this report was released by BuzzFeed. BuzzFeed is an outlet based in Great Britain. Before we went on the air, Agnes and I were chatting, and she made the point that BuzzFeed is the internet equivalent of the National Enquirer. It's not reputable. It's just throwing things out. So the fact of the matter is, it puts out this 35-page report on Mr. Trump, even though it admits that it has found factual errors and untruths in the report. But then BuzzFeed says, we're putting this out so that people can see it and make up their own minds. When I saw that quote, I went on BuzzFeed and I read that quote. And I thought, this is a violation of every element of principle of journalistic ethics that there is. Talk about not verifying your sources. When you know that your sources are not legitimate and you put out the salacious information anyway, it seems to me your status as anything coming close to reputable in the field of journalism must be called into question. David Korn, who's a reputable journalist and reporter for Mother Jones, who appears regularly on MSNBC for the most part. David Korn made the comment in response to this and said, even Donald Trump has a right to be protected from stuff like this. At the news conference, of course, Donald Trump denied all of this, denied the legitimacy of the report, and in the process attacked CNN because CNN was the only major network that picked up on this report and put out a 2-page summary of it. In the news conference, therefore, Donald Trump referred to CNN as fake news. And I watched this as the CNN reporter in the room, Jim Acosta, repeatedly was trying to get the opportunity to ask a question of Mr. Trump. And he kept speaking out and saying, you've attacked us. We have the right to be given the mic, to be given the floor in order to respond. And to that, Donald Trump said angrily, I'm not going to give you a question. You're fake news. Then he lashed out at BuzzFeed, referred to them as, quote, a failing pile of garbage, unquote, and promised that they're going to suffer the consequences. That's the second major issue. The news conference opened with members of Donald Trump's staff attacking the media. There are so many issues, so many ways to go at this, that it's hard to know where the best place is to begin. There's no question that there are political benefits to attacking the media, to attacking the legitimacy of the media. In the course of the last few months, Mr. Trump has attacked the New York Times. He's attacked the Washington Post. Just today, he's attacked CNN. And basically, what could be the long-term outcome of this in terms of the coverage of a Trump administration? What kind of investigative reporting and journalism from reputable news outlets and networks are we to expect when a president will attack and use access to the media to do it? As Mr. Trump said today, talking about this, I can respond because I've got this microphone and I'm here on television. I can protect myself. But then he talked about the numbers of people whose reputations have been destroyed by fake news, inaccurate news, out-and-out lies, etc. in the past, and didn't have the bully pulpit from which to respond. Trump says he has it. He also indicates and has proven that he'll use it. And what I'm suggesting is all of this has serious implications for the coverage of his administration and for the kind of investigative journalism that a republic, a popular government like ours must have. I ask you to think back to the quote from James Madison in his 1822 letter about people who live in an environment of self-government who are denied access to the news they need in order to participate intelligently in the direction of that popular government. We talked about this yesterday. Madison said that the result of this will be either a farce or a tragedy, or it could be both. Basically, even before Mr. Trump takes office, it seems to me he is putting the media on notice that if it attacks him, he will attack back. It does not for a minute escape notice that his familiarity and comfort with Twitter and the fact that he has an excess of 18 million people on his Twitter account, and that's liable to expand, gives him immediate access to tens of millions of citizens. Should he want to take on somebody who attacks him, the free press is in trouble. The role of the press in a republic like ours is critical. There's absolutely no question as to how important it is and how important it was envisioned by the founders. It's not an accident that the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States dealt with mechanisms needed in order to conduct the kind of journalistic investigation that made popular government in a republic possible. The First Amendment talked about free speech. In today's world, most of the time when we hear comments about free speech, we're usually thinking of it as the right to say whatever you want, whenever you want, about whatever you want. The fact of the matter is The reason the founders wanted free speech in the First Amendment is because they had in mind mostly political speech. And if intelligent decisions were going to be made, and if the general population, the citizenry, was to become informed about the issues and the knowledge they needed to have in order to participate intelligently in popular government, then free speech was a necessity, as was the right to assemble, as was the right to a free press. All of these things then find their way into the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. That's how important the founders believed the media and access to information was in this republic. This blatant, direct attack on the media that we witness today and that we have witnessed throughout the campaign is very, very serious. It raises serious constitutional issues because it is an effort to intimidate and potentially silence the media. At the same time, we need to deal realistically with what is happening to and in the media in today's world. The internet has created open season for the transfer and the publication of information. It has made it possible for non-reputable outfits and organizations to gain access to the world's public, to the world's citizens, by publishing information without verifying it, not doing the kind of background investigation necessary in order to demonstrate and prove the validity and the accuracy of the information that's being published.
Bill.
And that's what I think we're witnessing today. Yes, Agnes.
I'm going to jump in here.
Please do. Please do.
We were talking about communities earlier before you went on, and
right.
How there's always gossip, but it's on the low key because you have to live in that community.
Right.
People will backbite. Well, with the internet, you can do it all you want, and you don't suffer the ramifications.
No. Exactly right. That's a very, very important point.
Well, if you can get everybody fighting against each other, then you can do whatever you want.
Right.
Remember Tokyo Rose?
Very well.
Good source of media there, right?
Yes. Yes.
And 1942 Germany, I believe there wasn't free speech then.
Right. Right.
So someone is paying attention to history.
Right.
And whoever his groomers are, he's not very eloquent and he's not well spoken, but it's the art of the deal, and America's being sold.
Right. Well, I obviously, I see your point here. I'm very, very concerned about it. I'm very concerned about what this conscious attack on the media signifies in terms of what's coming during the administration that is about to begin. There are some serious issues associated with this administration anyway. The fact that his tax returns have not been released. The fact that many of the people who are being nominated for offices have not submitted the paperwork necessary to allow their backgrounds and their private interests to be investigated and addressed.
No, but they're the 1%.
Right. And the fact that they are all millionaires and billionaires.
Exactly.
And ex-generals. And, I mean, this is an administration potentially like none we've ever had before.
This is a war. This is a war administration.
It seems to be one that would warrant greater and more in-depth investigation than it's getting. And I think the behavior and the attitude of the candidate actually not a candidate now, the president-elect himself, by intimidating the media, is basically creating or insulating his administration from the kinds of questioning and the kinds of investigations that the general public would need. We have almost no option, it seems to me, as citizens left except to believe what we're being told. And that goes right back to the 1942 situation you referred to, Agnes.
Exactly. That's it in a nutshell. But what do we, on a general basis as human beings, if we find someone that wants to hide things, we don't trust them, right?
Right.
So what makes this any different?
I agree.
And it's been going on for quite a while. I mean, it's like a shell game, the elections. And I'm not, falling into a hole here.
Uh-huh.
When you look at the way the elections were handled, now he comes out and says, yeah, it happened, and I think it was them, but it's okay. What it comes down to is 20 years ago, America wouldn't have stood for that.
Right. And the other thing he said is he won't do it again. And the thing that impressed me about the press conference as I look back on it, and again, it just happened. So it's a little bit difficult to gain any sense of perspective at all. But the one thing that I did see in that press conference that I came away from it with is a sense that what he was doing is promising to fix everything. He claimed, and I think I've already mentioned this earlier, he took credit for making sure that the Russians weren't able to hack into the Republican National Committee. He claimed credit for that. He claims credit. He says that in the press conference today, he invited the media. He said, "You're all invited," except CNN, of course.
Well, of course.
You're all invited to the first week of business. The inauguration is going to be Friday, and everybody's going to be having fun. And then on Saturday, there's going to be a religious service. This may be the most important religious service we've ever had, because if there's a God up there, we need some help.
Well, I see lightning striking if that comes to it. But
and then so Mr. Trump said the first day of business is going to be the Monday after the inauguration. And Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday, and likely the rest of the week as well, is going to be taken up predominantly with a series of important signings. And you're all invited, the media, you're all invited to come and witness this. And what are the signings he's talking about? He's talking about repealing all the executive decisions and the executive orders that the outgoing president has passed and approved over the last portion of his administration.
Preschool behavior.
And so all of this stuff we're just going to go back and undo it all. And then, of course, comes the Affordable Care Act. And we're going to repeal that. And so the point, my concern was, the major concern I had was the attack on the media, I'll be honest. But the second thing that occurred to me is that in the campaign, he promised people that he could solve their problems, and whatever it was, he could fix it. He can fix the war on terrorism. He can fix the question of illegal immigration. He can fix our foreign policy. He can fix the unfairness of our trade policies. He can fix our infrastructure. He can fix the economy. He can fix health care. And so what we're dealing with here is a top-down source of making all decisions about everything. This is a popular government. This is a republic. And we spent quite a bit of time yesterday talking about that.
And he's going for the Caligula.
Right. Thomas Jefferson, in his approach to Republican government, which we spent quite a bit of time on yesterday, Thomas Jefferson's approach to republicanism is that it must be based on maximum participation of the citizenry in order to direct and guide a representative, responsive government. All of that is being reversed, is being shifted. And the source of the information that the citizenry would need in order to participate intelligently in this government is being rendered impotent by the attacks upon it by this administration,
Well,
or this coming administration.
I have a question. It just occurred to me because when you were talking, it kind of clicked. Since Donald Trump knew that before the elections that there was sabotage, espionage, you might say,
Right.
was going on, and since he fixed it, but the Democratic National Convention and all that was involved and they didn't do anything, doesn't that make him liable for high treason? There's a lot of questions like that. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
No, but I mean, you're right. I mean, I've heard some people, reputable people say, attorneys make the comment that the minute he takes the oath, he's in violation of the Constitution because of the potential conflict of interest and violations of the law with I mean, his attorneys have told him that he can appoint his daughter and son-in-law to White House positions and not be violating the Constitution. But that's his attorney's position, and the point is that would need to be worked out in a court of law. So potentially, the president will be in violation of the law the minute he takes the oath of office.
But if you...
and now you've pointed out something else, that he knew that there's international hacking going on,
which is an attack, even though it's a cyber attack, it's still
and he protects himself from being hacking, but he allows the hacking to continue on other people.
And what kind of information has he been getting?
Yeah. And this report that BuzzFeed put out claims that for 5 years, the Russians have been feeding Trump information on his political opponents. And that they have personal information on him which would compromise his behavior. Every one of these things raises serious questions about whether, in fact, this man ought to be given the oath of office at all.
That's true, but I think that we've kind of gone past that.
I think we have too. I really do.
And I'll let you go ahead because
okay, and I appreciate it. I wanted to get your sense, because you talked about community, and the issue of gossip and backbiting and talking over the back fence, so to speak, about other people. But at the same time, since it is a community and people live in that community, they have to be very, very careful about what they say.
Exactly.
Whereas the internet removes all of those controls or all of those restraints and makes it possible to say whatever you want to say about anybody you want to say it about and get away with it and not have to pay any consequences.
We're looking at the laws of human nature being broken.
The issues, the laws of liability, for example, the idea of free speech. The laws of liability still apply. You can say things, but on the other hand, if you defame somebody's reputation, you open yourselves to some sort of liability.
Exactly.
That's still there, but the internet is not responsible for that, because I just thought it was incredible that BuzzFeed put out this document, even though they knew that there were inaccuracies in it. They put it out anyway and said that they wanted to leave it up to people to make up their own mind.
What do we call bad journalists, though?
That's
a hack.
Yeah. That's a good point. That's
irony.
That's a good point. So anyway, this is absolutely incredible stuff, Agnes, and I don't know. The one thing that I mentioned that the two things that I came across away from the news conference was first concern about the attack on the media, and secondly the arrogance and the idea that I can fix anything and everything But the third thing, and I think this is something that I think all of us need to be aware of. The mere fact that all of this is going on, that all of these issues are out there flying around. I mean, this press conference was incredible in that members of the media were tripping over each other trying to ask questions. There are so many issues out there that need to be talked about that it's almost impossible for the media to, even if they want to, even if they're not intimidated against doing it. The fact is there's so many issues, so many things out there that are happening simultaneously that the media can't focus on any one of them. The irony is that's exactly what was going on throughout the campaign. Is if you remember back through the campaign, candidate Trump seemed to be putting, media people were saying he's putting his foot in his mouth one time after the other, that he kept making these gaffes and these wild Twitter attacks, in the middle of the night and things. And there were so many issues that before you got a chance to focus on one, he'd do something else. And the fact of the matter is there were so many issues flying around out there that it became impossible to hold him accountable for any one of them. Because the fact of the matter is each one alone by itself is not really that significant, in a sense, political sense. You can't derail a campaign for the presidency based on one of these issues, theoretically. But in reality, when there are so many of them out there at the same time, it's the multiplicity of them that really shields him from responsibility for any of it. And it's the same thing that we were talking about with the internet and the media, that the responsibilities and the restraints that that living in community would place on people's willingness to gossip and say untrue things about others, the internet eliminates that responsibility as well. And the point is, it makes it impossible to focus on anything. I think I made the point the other day in our program, maybe it was last week, that initially, I think it's been changed. Today is the day. But on this day, the Wednesday of this week, initially there were 5 confirmation hearings scheduled for today, in addition to President Trump's news conference. There's no way that the media can get a handle on that and focus on and deliver to the general public the kinds of information on any of those that would be necessary, because there were 5 confirmation hearings going on simultaneously, plus a presidential or president-elect's news conference. What that means is that so much potential news out there that none of it gets the attention or the investigation that good journalism demands. It really makes investigative journalism impossible. And I know Agnes mentioned to me when we were chatting before we went on the air that she oftentimes will find, going back, trying to find the original source. And you go to sources, and references, and it's basically research skills. I know from teaching college and graduate courses that one of the most important skills you teach professionals is the ability to do research, the ability to do investigation and to find the sources and find the data and the information that they need in order to basically reach or complete reports or whatever you need to do. And that requires that you trace back until you get to the original source. There's no way in the world that there's time to do that with the amount of news that's being created all at one time. I don't believe, this is obviously my own perception, I don't believe that this is an accident, because Mr. Trump's campaign was conducted the same way. The reason and the way that he was able to dominate the media, to dominate the news, to be the lead story every single day in the news throughout the campaign, was the fact that he was making news all the time. He was making so much news that it became impossible for the media to cover or follow anything else except him, which meant that he got literally billions of free dollars in free airtime for his campaign. He said consistently at the beginning that he was funding his own campaign. But the reality is that funding didn't cost him nearly what it cost his opponents, because they had to pay for political advertising. He didn't. He was the news. He was the front page story every single day in every major newspaper in the country, in the world, potentially. So what that meant was he gained access to all the kinds of free publicity, free coverage, and all of it. That happened during the campaign. Now, during the transition, before he even takes office, the same kinds of things are happening. All of his confirmation hearings are happening in the same week at approximately the same time. His first press conference in 6 months is scheduled at 11 a.m. on the same day that 5 of his nominees are undergoing confirmation hearings. As it turns out, 2 of the 5 have been postponed, and we're down to 3. But the fact of the matter is there's so much happening that it's not possible to investigate thoroughly any of it. And I don't think that's an accident. I don't think it's an accident at all. It's a brilliant political strategy. And it's coupled, in my mind, with this attack on the media, and that's the thing that probably bothers me more than anything else related to this news conference today and to this particular issue. Before we get off the news conference entirely, one of the major issues covered in that news conference, of course, was Mr. Trump's promise to repeal Obamacare. And the one thing he said, and I posted a link yesterday to an article on Facebook, on our Facebook page, that related to an article, and there actually was several. I could have put any number of different articles on there. But this one seemed to me to be extremely informative about the repeal of the Affordable Care Act and the determination of Republican leaders in Congress to go forward with this repeal of the Affordable Care Act and not to waste any time doing it. In other words, to expedite the repeal as much as possible. Even though many folks were trying to claim that you can't repeal healthcare legislation that would negatively impact 11.5 million citizens without replacing it with something else. And the fact that the Republican Party over the last 4 years of the Obama administration has passed repeal legislation more than 50 times, each time to see it defeated in the Senate. But the fact of the matter is, there's no question that from the very beginning, the Republican Party has been committed to overturning the Affordable Care Act. The reality is that up to this point, they've come up with no replacement. Now many people are beginning to say, if you're going to take away the health coverage for 11.5 million people with one swipe of the pen, you almost have a responsibility to replace it with something. Today in the press conference, Mr. Trump promised that the repeal would simultaneously be accompanied with replacement legislation which would provide something less expensive and better coverage for more people. This is the kind of response without specificity that we've come to expect. In the article that I posted put the link to on our Facebook page yesterday. There was one issue in that article that caused me to post the link. And let me read this paragraph. Quote, more than 20 million people could lose their health insurance and states could lose billions of dollars in Medicaid money, said Kenneth Rask, the president of the Greater New York Hospital Association. But he added many healthcare executives, quote, don't want to get on the wrong side of the new administration or the Republican majority in Congress, unquote. What that quote says is that the people in healthcare who really know the field, the people who know what the issues are reluctant to raise flags or to say anything for fear that they'll be cut out of the issue, of the deal, that they'll be eliminated from whatever happens in healthcare. So in a sense, that major healthcare executives throughout the country are intimidated by the Republican control of Congress and by the anticipated inauguration of Donald Trump as Republican president of the United States. So not only is Mr. Trump intimidating the media, but he's also intimidating those in healthcare. This is the issue that it seems to me, because traditionally, when you're dealing with a major complex issue like healthcare, not only do you, before you develop something, you hold hearings and you bring in the experts. What this article suggests is that the experts are laying low. They're taking cover because, as happened this morning in the press conference to CNN, once you get out there and take a position in opposition to this administration and this incoming president, you basically expose yourself to attack, to public humiliation, to being eliminated from the opportunity to cover the administration. I mean, theoretically, CNN could be in serious trouble right now because its people could be denied access to the White House and to the kinds of information that they would need in order to cover this administration. It seems to me that those are the kinds of issues we're dealing with. This program, the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, is driven on a mission to look at the structure of government in this republic, and especially to look at the significance of the citizens' responsibility to participate intelligently in that government. And many of the things that are happening now threaten the basic ingredients and the foundations of this republic. The attack on the media, the elimination of the Affordable Care Act. I'm not basically claiming the infallibility of the Affordable Care Act, but it seems to me, and President Obama in his address last evening, and this we haven't even got to this yet, talk about taking the impetus away from President Obama's absolutely superb farewell address last evening. In ordinary situations or circumstances, that kind of an address by an outgoing president who has served for 8 years would be headline stuff in the newspapers and in the media. But instead of getting the attention that it deserves, Donald Trump schedules his first press conference in 6 months, the morning after the president delivers his farewell address. In other words, he took back the headlines. He took back access to the media. He took back control of the news. He basically successfully took away the thrust and the emphasis and the significance of President Obama's farewell address. And in the process, he did it with statements like the following. BuzzFeed News is an organization he called a failing pile of garbage. At another point in the press conference today, Mr. Trump, I can't lay my hands right now on this particular thing, but what he talked about was something related to a pile of crap. I think it's very important to consider some of these comments against the background or the backdrop of President Obama's farewell address last evening. The difference, the contrast, it seems to me, between the two media events is incredible. And it seems to me to suggest an awful lot about what promises to be a wild ride. We're approaching the end of our first hour. I believe we have about 2 minutes left before we reach the top of the hour. I think this is a good place to take our break. When we come back, I'd like to deal a little bit with the Affordable Care Act. And more than anything else, I'd like to share with you a story that appeared in our local papers just today about the Affordable Care Act. And then, pending, and again, if we get calls, if our listeners would call, then we can continue with this. If not, I'd like to return to a few of the issues that we dealt with yesterday, more specifically, this idea of identity politics and the problems that it seems to raise for Democrats and for liberals, not only in the recent election, but even issues since that time and for the foreseeable future. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're going to pause and take a 5-minute break, and then we'll be right back with our second hour. I hope that you'll stay with us. Thank you. Thank you, Agnes, and welcome to our second hour in this Wednesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It's just a couple of minutes beyond the top of the hour, and if you are just joining us, welcome to today's edition of the Virtual Center. If you've been with us through the first hour, then you heard quite a bit of commentary and comments about Mr. Trump's press conference this morning and about the what I believe is a focused attack on the credibility of the media and the extent to which some who claim to be representative of the media warrant such an attack. I'm thinking specifically of some of the less reputable outlets that we begin to see on the internet. And I'd like to maybe return to this issue a little bit. But first, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank everybody for tuning in to today's version of the Virtual Center and invite you to participate actively in our program in any number of ways. The most direct and obvious and I think valuable way for you to participate is to call in and come on the air and let's talk about some of these issues. I hope that you will feel comfortable doing that. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. 877-888-7676. If you feel more comfortable dropping me an email and sharing your thoughts or concerns that way, then I would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN 906@gmail.com. And then finally, our Facebook page. And if you go to our Facebook page, there are a number of postings on there that I've put on the Facebook page over the last several days. Most of them relate to links to particular articles. In some cases, I tend to sound off on particular issues myself. But usually, if I find an article that touches upon those issues, I put the link on there and then look at the article as it affects the particular issue that I feel I might have something to contribute or something something important or significant to say about that particular issue. So again, if you go to Facebook and in the search box at the top of the homepage, type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will be into our Facebook page. And there are all sorts of invitations and opportunities on Facebook for you to respond or offer an opinion on some of the things that are on this Facebook page. And that's really what the postings are, is almost an invitation for your reaction to the particular issue at question raised by the particular posting or the commentary that I've taken the opportunity to include on our Facebook page. Before we entirely leave the issue that we were talking about in our first hour, which is the press conference this morning and the attack on the media and the extent to which the internet has opened the opportunity for some less reputable I'm going to say forms of journalism, but there's some question as to whether it's journalism at all. In other words, all the rules, all the constraints or the restrictions that define good journalism are removed on the internet. Anybody can put whatever they want on the internet. And that really, it seems to me, and this is the one issue that I think we didn't mention in our first hour that I didn't want to let pass without mentioning it. And that is the ability of the reader, the ability of citizens to handle this kind of flood of news. We are being overwhelmed with information. It's an information deluge. And the real issue that comes back to our education system is whether, in fact, our education system is adequately preparing our young people to handle this kind of news. In the case of what we're talking about reputable journalism as opposed to journalism that is not reputable, it seems to me that there are no restraints. And again, the efforts of some to put restraints on the internet gets us into the issue of censorship, which raises some serious questions on its own. So barring that, or in the absence of such restrictions or such limitations or such controls, the only control or the only thing left is to rely on the skills and the ability of the reader to decipher or determine what constitutes reputable journalism and what constitutes journalism that is not reputable, what constitutes fact and what constitutes opinion, where in fact information is substantiated and where in fact it is not. And my concern, and I've expressed this many times here on the Virtual Center, I don't think that we are adequately preparing our young people, our citizens, for the responsibility of citizenship that their role as citizens demands, that our republic demands. Our republic demands an intellectual level of skill and ability amongst our citizens that I believe our educational institutions, our K through 12 institutions, and even a number of our higher education institutions are not, at least at this point, delivering. The fact of the matter is, people don't know what to believe. They don't know what's true from what's not true. When I was teaching and grading student essays, one of the things that became very clear to me on exams and papers that students wrote was the fact that many students have difficulty distinguishing or determining the most important from the less important pieces of information and data. Some students, for some students, it's even worse than that. They really can't distinguish fact from interpretation. But with the amount of information that the internet makes available to us, it becomes absolutely critical that we find some way to filter that information, that we find some way to reorganize it so that we can separate the important from the less important. So we know what issues we need to focus on and what issues really don't warrant that kind of attention. Those skills are critical in handling the deluge of information that is available now as a result of the internet. And the fact of the matter is, most of our people are not able to do that, which means that they really don't know what to believe and what not to believe. They're totally confused. The only answer that many of them have to this dilemma is to trust information from those they trust and to deny information from those they don't. And the result is that most people tend to gravitate naturally to the sources for the information that they're most comfortable with. What that means is that most citizens do not consciously allow themselves to be exposed to alternative points of view. They are looking for people who agree with them. They are avoiding those that don't. And the fact of the matter is that our education system and the skills that we demand from students require that students be forced to confront points of view and opinions different from their own. If they don't do that, then their education becomes very narrow. Their point of view becomes very provincial. I think that one of the things we've seen in the last election is what the results of that kind of provincialism and narrowness produces. The result is that citizens become vulnerable to the most persuasive arguments. In ancient Greece, this was the major criticism of the Stoics, that Stoicism placed so much emphasis on presentation rather than substance, and on the ability of particular presentations to persuade the listener of a point of view. And consequently, the people that were best able to master persuasive information presentation were the people that were able to get their way. And that's, it seems to me, what we're dealing with in our republic today. It's extremely dangerous because it renders the bulk of our citizens incapable of separating the important from the unimportant, of distinguishing between facts and interpretation, or from identifying out untruths, lies, half-truths, innuendos, and all the rest of it. Many of the skills, the higher order cognitive skills that a quality education requires, and that a republic like ours demands, are not, at present at least, part of our K through 12 education system for the most part. And that's kind of what, that's me, it seems to me, leaves citizens vulnerable to the kinds of things and the kinds of demagoguery that we've been talking about. One of the things that I mentioned, that one of the issues I'd like to deal with in this second hour is the issue of the Affordable Care Act and the extent to which its repeal minus replacement with something else, preferably something better, but something, is critical. In our local paper this morning, the headline deals with a business owner, a woman, who owns a small business in this region, who expressed serious concern about repeal of the Affordable Care Act. I wanted to share her story with you because I think it's an important one. Basically, she has a pre-existing condition. Consequently, she's extremely worried about what's liable to happen to her health care. She owns a business in a county very, very close to where I'm speaking from. And recently she wrote one of West Virginia's two senators, Republican Sheila Moore Capito, to express her concerns about the repeal of the Affordable Care Act without a meaningful replacement. She said in that letter to Senator Capito, quote, I have health insurance. I would not have health insurance were it not for the Affordable Care Act. And the story goes on. If I lose coverage, I no longer qualify for copay assistance from the drug company that manufactures the drug. Without that assistance, I would not be able to afford the $5,026 per month drug, and therefore I'd run the risk of experiencing my debilitating disease progressing faster than it would if I were not taking the drug. Turns out that she has a condition which, if she does not take this medication, causes lesions on her brain. It is an incurable disease. She says in the response that she received from Senator Capito and the Affordable Care Act, the senator said the following, that the Affordable Care Act is the wrong approach to addressing health care reform, and that she remains committed to repealing the Affordable Care Act's most harmful provisions. She also said that there are ongoing discussions in Washington about more sensible solutions. She didn't directly answer many of the questions that were asked of her. And the woman who runs the business, who initially made the contact, said the following, I believe a substantial transition period is important in order to preserve access for those who have their coverage through Obamacare, while a replacement plan is implemented. And that's one of the things that President-elect Trump addressed this morning in the press conference, that he said that the replacement and appeal would happen very close to simultaneously. My biggest beef with Congress, she said, at the moment is the rush to appeal without consideration of a replacement. The other senator from West Virginia, who's a Democrat, Senator Joe Manchin, is outspoken and says that he will not support repeal without a replacement plan in place. Quote, I think the people have spoken loud and clear, Senator Manchin said. They want something better. But I'm not going to throw 170,000 West Virginians out in the cold. I'm just not going to do that unless I see a better plan. And then the article points out that nationwide, more than 11.5 million people are signed up for health insurance under the marketplace contained in the Affordable Care Act. This is the kind of issue that it seems to me we're dealing with. I think that story pretty much says quite a bit about why so many people are so concerned about repeal of the Affordable Care Act without putting something in its place. The issue that I'd like to focus on, I'm not going to go into a long harangue about this, but I'd like to spend a moment at least addressing the issue of medication that costs over $5,000 a month. In fact, I was talking to somebody today earlier who made the comment that they used to be on medication that ran as much as $12,000 a month. There's no way, it seems to me, that any healthcare system could possibly continue to pay those kinds of prescription charges for prescription drugs without going broke. If you remember, the most controversial part of the Affordable Care Act was the requirement that healthy young people be required to have health insurance because their premiums would help pay for the coverage of older citizens and citizens with pre-existing conditions that required this kind of medication. But nobody raises the ethics of drugs that cost that much. We hear all the time that the cost of medication within the United States exceeds that of any other nation in the world. We also know that President Bush, George W. Bush, in the approval of the B medical plan, basically passed or got through Congress legislation that forbade the government from negotiating drug prices. So the fact of the matter is, whatever the charge was, it had to be paid. There's no way that any drug or healthcare plan can deal realistically with those kinds of costs. Here locally, we were dealing with the EpiPen issue about a month ago. And the tremendous increase in this particular medication, up to $600 for 2 applications. There's no way that individual citizens can pay this. The only reason that drug prices have been allowed to get that high is because of the insurance industry's willingness to pay them. The result is that the cost of healthcare, the cost of medication, is totally out of sight. There's no way to get a handle on escalating drug costs when there's no rationale or logical explanation for the costs other than that's what the manufacturer chooses to charge, take it or leave it. And what we see is that whatever the replacement plan is for the Affordable Care Act, the fact of the matter is we're dealing with an administration that is less likely to endorse any kind of government controls on pricing of medication, even less than the outgoing administration was willing to do so. it has seemed to me, and I guess I have to confess that I'm one of these defenders for the idea of single payer universal health care. That government basically needs to make health care available to everybody, because in today's world, health care is a human need. It's not a commodity that people can continue to pay for because pricing has gone out of sight. Consequently, if it is a human need, then it seems to me it's society's responsibility to make it available, not just to those with the money to buy it, but to all citizens. What that means is that some sort of controls on pricing would have to be part of the package. And we're looking at the incoming administration that is less likely to support price controls on medications and on the healthcare industry than the outgoing administration. Fact of the matter is, it wasn't willing to deal with that anyway, which explains the requirement that the laws of the market suggest that in order to cover the costs of drugs for medication for those who need it, you've got to basically require health care from those who don't in order to help pay for it. It's the same principle that drove the creation of Social Security in the 1930s. That ultimately what you do is everybody pays into it, and therefore there's sufficient revenue to take care of retirees. But now we know, and again, in large part, it's because of the advances in healthcare. People are living so much longer now after they retire that clearly some sort of alteration in our Social Security system, in our Medicare system, seems to me to be warranted. But I didn't want to let this story go by about the Affordable Care Act without at least making mention of the incredible costs of healthcare. And I think many people out there who are probably listening to this have experienced the kind of costs that I'm talking about. It would break individuals. It will break the nation unless some control, some way is found to minimize or to maximize or to place controls on pricing. Nobody seems ever to raise the ethical questions associated with pricing. What they usually respond to questions with is the idea that it's the market, whatever the market will bear. Whatever citizens will pay, that's the cost. So what you do is you just keep raising costs until you reach the point where people can't pay it anymore. And that tells you what your maximum charge can be. That's a dream. It's illusionary. It is not based on any sense of responsibility to the general public at all. Government's responsibility, according to the preamble to the Constitution of the United States, is to promote the general welfare. It seems to me that the general welfare is access to health care. And government's responsibility is to find ways to make health care available to everybody. That's what the preamble to the Constitution requires. And it seems to me that's the only guide or the only way that we have a chance to get a handle on what's going on in healthcare. So with that, I do invite your comments or your questions or your concerns related to that issue, because I think it's an incredibly important one. It affects all of us. I know as I get older, it's affecting me, like any other citizen as they get older and who is retired. My health care, my prescription costs continue to go up every year. as I get older because I need more and more health care than I did. I would go years without needing anything. In fact, I even resented the cost of checkups in order for the doctor to tell me that everything was fine. That went on for years. It's not going on now. And I think all of us experience the same kind of thing. As we get older, we require more health care. We require more access to more prescription drugs. How are we going as a society to deal with that? It seems to me it's a huge question. But as we talked in our first hour today, with the kinds of issues and the kinds of the variety of issues that is hitting the news all at the same time, this thing almost gets pushed to the back burner, and it affects so many citizens it shouldn't be. Anyway, I really believe that this is an important issue. Before we get back, and I don't know how much of our time we'll have left today to even deal with this, we may have to postpone the real serious consideration of this idea of identity politics into next week, into our coming programs. Because there's one additional issue, and in fact it's related to the Jefferson letter that we spent the last 2 days on the nature of republicanism. And it's one aspect of that particular issue, or that particular letter, that I really neglected to mention in the course of covering it. And I wanted to do it. And I think the reason will become obvious. One of the issues, or one of the things that Thomas Jefferson deals with in his letter on republicanism is the issue, as we've spoke so often, and as Jefferson talked about so, I think, brilliantly. As much as possible in a republic, Jefferson believed, you need to turn as much decision-making and responsibility as is possible over to the citizens. Even though there are many people who sometimes for their own self-interest deny the ability of the people to perform these kinds of behavior or to take on this kind of responsibility. One of the issues that we talked about, that Jefferson talked about, is the election of judges. Jefferson takes issue with many of the other founders, especially those who are the architects of the Federalist Papers, Hamilton and Madison. Jefferson disagrees with them on the issue of lifetime appointments for members of the judiciary. Jefferson believes that this is not right, that it is inconsistent with republicanism because it creates a situation where the interpretation of the law is being done by people who have reached such an age that the society, in a sense, is being constrained by the generations that came before it. Jefferson believed that each generation deserves the opportunity to update the interpretations of the Constitution in order to make sure that it continues to meet the demands of government in a republic. In other words, Jefferson believes in the idea of what we call a living constitution. The fact that the Constitution is not changed to the interpretation of law as it existed in the past, but that these interpretations need to change and be updated as circumstances change. This gets into the question of the appointment of judges. Jefferson believes and says that appointments, nominations for appointment, must be made by the executive branch of government. And what he's particularly concerned about in the Virginia Constitution is that most appointments are coming out of the legislature rather than out of the governor's office. And Jefferson believes that this really violates the principle of separation of powers. He says the following: nomination to office is an executive function. To give it to the legislature, as we do, is a violation of the principle of separation of powers. It swerves the members from correctness by temptations to intrigue for offices themselves and to a corrupt barter of votes, and destroys responsibility by dividing it among a multitude. By leaving a nomination in its proper place among executive functions, the principle of the distribution of power is preserved, and responsibility weighs with its heaviest force on a single head. Jefferson believes that in a government based on the principle of separation of powers, the nomination and appointment of officers and administrators and judges needs to come from the executive branch of government. Obviously, we are confronting that issue right now, because we know that since the death of Antonin Scalia in February of last year, the Republican-controlled Senate has forbidden or made it impossible for the executive, in this case the President of the United States, to find or appoint a replacement. That particular seat on the Supreme Court has remained vacant since Scalia's death last February. In a sense, the point that I wanted to make is that this situation clearly is in contradiction or violation to the Republican principles sketched out by Thomas Jefferson in this letter. But it goes even deeper than that. Last weekend, the first weekend of the new year, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts, issued the report on the Supreme Court's activities and behavior and accomplishments over the previous year. Justice Roberts delivered that position paper or that report last weekend on the court's activities and accomplishments for the year 2015. In that report, Justice Roberts never mentioned the vacancy on the Supreme Court, even though that vacancy existed for all but a very short period of the entire year that the report was about. How could the Chief Justice of the United States issue a report, an annual report, on the behavior and happenings of his court and not mention the fact that the court had been operating for 10 of the 12 months, better than 10 of the 12 months, with an outstanding vacancy? More specifically, how could the Chief Justice issue such a report and not mention that vacancy without also mentioning that it was the Senate of the United States blocking the ability of the executive to make this appointment that was at issue? On the 5th of January, which is 6 days ago, the Supreme Court reporter for the New York Times, the the member of the Times who regularly covers the court, Linda Greenhouse, posted an op-ed piece in the Times in which she addresses the question of what Chief Justice Roberts should have said in his annual report on the court. Basically, that Justice Roberts neglected to defend the issue of judicial independence. And if you go back to Hamilton's position paper in Federalist number 68 on the Supreme Court, Hamilton's entire position and defense of lifetime appointments for judges is based on the principle of maintaining judicial independence. It's very clear that the obstruction in the president's appointment power over the last year is clearly a detrimental threat to the independence of the judiciary. And yet Justice Roberts, in his annual report, never mentions the vacancy or never mentions the responsibility of the Republican majority in the Senate for that vacancy. We know that President Obama nominated a replacement, Merrick Garland, and the Senate responded to that by denying Garland even hearings, which violates Article 3 of the Constitution, in which the role of the executive to nominate and the responsibility of the Senate to confirm judicial appointments is laid out in the Constitution of the United States. Linda Greenhouse takes Chief Justice Roberts to task for this. And in defense of her position in criticizing Justice Roberts, she goes back to a previous justice of the Supreme Court, Chief Justice Rehnquist, and points out that Rehnquist, on two specific occasions while he was Chief Justice, responded directly to challenges to the independence of the judiciary, whereas Justice Roberts neglected to do that at all. She points out that some years ago, several members of Congress, including Bob Dole, who was a member of the Senate at that time, called for the impeachment of a federal district judge in New York, Harold Bayer Jr., because Justice Bayer had ruled that the evidence in a drug case could not be used in court because it was the product of an illegal search. The exclusionary rule. For those of you who are regular viewers of Law and Order on television, you've seen that law come up many times. If you're going to conduct a search, you've got to get a warrant. And if evidence is seized in an illegal search, it can't be used as evidence in a court of law. Justice Harold Bayer in New York cited this exclusionary rule in order to deny evidence that was recovered illegally. Greenhouse also points out that President Bill Clinton, during the 1996 re-election campaign, let it be known that he thought it would be a good idea if Judge Beyer resigned from the bench. Rehnquist didn't allow this action by the Senate, by Senator Dole and others, nor the behavior of President Bill Clinton in 1996 to go without a response. And he immediately jumped to the defense of the court and the independence of the judiciary. Greenhouse points out also that a few years before that, in the early 90s, Justice Rehnquist had published a book entitled Grand Inquests. And this book was about the Senate's refusal in 1805 to convict and remove Justice Samuel Chase, who had been impeached by the House of Representatives. From office. The Supreme Court refused to remove Samuel Chase, who at that time was a justice on the Supreme Court of the United States. And in Rehnquist's book, Grand Inquests, he points out that the court's justification for this refusal to remove Chase was the guiding principle that federal judges should never be impeached for their decisions. If a federal judge is removed because others don't agree with the decision that that judge reached in a case, that directly infringes upon the lifetime appointments of judges. It threatens the independence of the judiciary. In his book, Rehnquist said, quote, "From that day to this, one of the crown jewels of our system of government is judicial independence. And every time the political branches of government threaten judicial independence, it's the responsibility of the Supreme Court to respond, and to do it on the basis of judicial independence." Justice Roberts did not do that. Justice Roberts has not responded to the behavior of Mitch McConnell and the behavior of the Republican majority in the United States Senate. I raise this issue now because one of the issues that Donald Trump raised in his press conference this morning was the prospective appointment of a replacement for Justice Scalia. And Donald Trump promised, he made reference to the list of 20 prospective nominees that he had put out some months ago during the campaign. And he said this morning that already a number of those individuals have been interviewed. Of course, he made the point that all of them are excellent nominees. And that within a very, very short period of time, he would be making a nomination to fill the vacancy on the Supreme Court that exists because of the death of Antonin Scalia. The fact of the matter is that vacancy has existed for 11 months. It's very likely that by the time a replacement is named, that vacancy will have existed for a full year. And the reason the court has been forced to operate with this vacancy is because of the behavior of the Republican majority in Congress. And the Supreme Court has done or said nothing about it. I guess the question is why? What does that say about Justice Roberts and his leadership of the court? What does it say about Justice Roberts' commitment to judicial precedent and to the priorities of judicial independence? What does it say about the prospective behavior of the Supreme Court in the context of the coming Trump administration? What does it say about the likelihood that the Supreme Court is going to be willing, the majority at least, is going to be willing to take on the Trump administration should it be guilty of constitutional violations? Are we, in effect, looking at a situation where not only has Donald Trump and those that support him taken on the media, but one must wonder whether, in fact, it has also successfully intimidated the Supreme Court of the United States, or at least its Chief Justice. There's no way in the world that Justice Roberts didn't know or understand what the Republican Party's obstruction of President Obama's appointment, nomination, and right to appoint meant. There's no possibility in the world that Justice Roberts didn't realize that this violated the separation of powers. It not only violates Jefferson's letter, it violates the substance of what Jefferson's letter speaks to, the Republican nature of our government in terms of separation of powers and the idea of effective checks and balances. This is exactly what checks and balances is all about. And Justice Roberts not only chose to not do anything about it, he chose not to even mention it in his annual report. It seems to me that this is, in addition to the other things we've talked about today, an extremely significant issue. It's another issue that disturbs me very, very much. It gives me pause and causes me to become even more anxious about the administration that's due to come into power in a week's time. I've made comments on Facebook on a number of postings that I put there in the recent weeks that it's beginning to look like we're in for a wild ride. But it's only today that I think we've addressed some of the very specific aspects of what that wild ride might constitute. A media that is too intimidated to challenge the administration. A media that is too intimidated to perform the legitimate ethical duties that define reputable journalism. One of my closest friends in graduate school, who just retired as Dean of the Honors College at the University of Missouri. I've mentioned him many times on this program, Bob Bliss. Bob's dad taught journalism at Drake University in Iowa before he passed away some years ago. Bob's dad's dissertation for the PhD in journalism was a dissertation on the case of New York Times versus Sullivan, which dealt with exactly these kinds of issues. And I've thought often in the last couple of days about how Bob's dad would respond to Mr. Trump's concerted effort to intimidate the media, and what this might mean in terms of the media's legitimate role in a republic based on separation of powers. In order for citizens of the United States to fulfill their civic responsibilities as citizens in a republic, it is absolutely required that they have access to information they need in order to act intelligently and wisely. They need to be informed. And it's the role of the media, the role of journalists, to uncover and reveal that kind of legitimate information, not lies and half-truths and misrepresentations and all the rest of it, but legitimate journalism, legitimate research and reporting of the kinds of issues that people must have. One of the major debates that you hear off and on referred to over the last couple of years is the question about Snowden, the former employee, federal employee, who released all of the information on some of the behavior and activities of the American government and the NSA and all the rest of it. I know I've had this discussion in my own home. My wife believes that Snowden is a traitor. And as long as he remains in Russia, he's untouchable. She thinks that we ought to get him back and he ought to be tried as a traitor. I tend to think that Snowden, in light of our form of government, is performing a public service. He did what I believe he had to do in order for people to know the kinds of things that he knew were going on. The only way they could know is to make sure the information got out. And of course, it was to government's interests to not reveal this information. So Snowden released it. Is he a traitor or is he a hero? I think back to the early 70s and the release of the Pentagon Papers on the Vietnam War. It was the release of those papers that basically stimulated the protests that ultimately ended the Vietnam War and potentially saved lives. It seems to me that these are some of the important questions that some of the issues we've addressed today raise. I wasn't sure what today's program was going to involve because there was so much going on at the same time. I hope that I was able to do some justice to it. We've reached the end of our program today. Actually, this is the end of our programming for the week. It's 59 minutes after the hour. I want to thank you for tuning in and your continued support of the Virtual Center. I do invite you to join us when we do live programming again next Monday. In the meantime, I hope you have a wonderful evening and a wonderful rest of the week and weekend. Be kind to each other. Thank you so very, very much for your continued support of the Head On Radio Network and the Virtual Center. Thank you.